Namaskar friends. Post-colonial South Asia has been no stranger to political unrest. However, what distinguishes the present moment is the eruption of major protests in the triangle of Sri Lanka, Bangladesh and Nepal in quick succession. Each has challenged entrenched elites, exposing institutional failures and revealed the role of youth and social media in reshaping politics. While differing in context and triggers, these movements reflect common themes: the crisis of governance, economic stress, generational demands for accountability, and the limits of entrenched elites. I am Tilak Devasher, and you are watching The Great Game Reloaded. Despite their differences, let's start with looking at the common drivers of the protests in Sri Lanka in 2022, Bangladesh 2024, and Nepal 2025. 1. Economic collapse or strain undermining daily survival. 2. Corruption and political arrogance alienating citizens. 3. Youth frustration over unemployment and lack of opportunities. 4. Weak institutions incapable of mediating discontent. 5. Role of social media for mobilization and setting the agenda. 6. The youthful age profile and the problem of the unrealized demographic dividend. Now let's look at the specific context and triggers of each of these movements. Sri Lanka. Sri Lanka's Aragalaya or struggle movement of 2022 is a case study of how spontaneous, leaderless and multi-class mobilization toppled a dynasty. The protests were a culmination of decades of dynastic rule, economic mismanagement, and post-Civil War complacency. Since 2005, the Rajapaksa family had dominated Sri Lankan politics. Mahinda Rajapaksa won the presidency in 2005, presiding over the brutal but decisive end of the Civil War in 2009. Gotabaya Rajapaksa, Mahinda's brother and former defense secretary, won the presidency in 2019 after the Easter Sunday terror attacks, riding a wave of Sinhala Buddhist nationalism. Externally, Sri Lanka's embrace of Chinese loans for infrastructure compounded vulnerability. The Hambantota port lease became a global symbol of debt trap. By 2021, reserves dried up, debt repayments loomed, and the COVID-19 pandemic decimated tourism, one of Sri Lanka's main foreign exchange earners. By early 2022, the island faced its worst crisis since independence. Power cuts, fuel queues stretching for miles, medicine shortages, and inflation exceeding 50%. For ordinary citizens, life became unbearable. In early April, peaceful protests began in Colombo and spread rapidly across the island. The Galle-faced green in the capital became the epicenter of what came to be called the Aragalaya, which is Sinhala for struggle. The Aragalaya achieved what few thought possible. It brought down the Rajapaksa dynasty. It marked a watershed. It shattered dynastic invincibility and demonstrated the power of mass mobilization. Its significance was that it created a unified civic consciousness, transcending ethnic lines, where people saw themselves as citizens and not merely as Sinhalese, Tamil or Muslims. This was rare in Sri Lanka's post-Civil War landscape. Now let's turn to Bangladesh. Quota protests and beyond, 2018 and 2024. In Bangladesh in 2018, students protested the government job quota system, which reserved 56% of positions for certain groups, leaving few for merit-based candidates. The government promised reforms but cracked down later. In 2024, the quota reform movement protests surged again. It was student-led, spreading across Dhaka and other cities. Demonstrations were peaceful at first, with slogans like, quote-unquote, "We want justice, not quota privilege." Social media amplified their demands, bypassing state-controlled outlets. The police cracked down, firing tear gas and arresting leaders. Between 650 to 700 people were believed to have died. As a result, the protests radicalized. Dhaka University and Shahbag Square became epicenters of defiance. Hasina initially did not take the protests seriously, but as demonstrations swelled, her government promised reforms. Later, however, the crackdown intensified. Leaders were arrested, campuses militarized, and media censored. The protests morphed into an anti-government movement fueled by disillusionment with Sheikh Hasina's long incumbency, perceived authoritarianism, and suppression of dissent. The protests led to the resignation and flight of Sheikh Hasina. Bangladesh now faces an uncertain transition with a fragile interim authority under economist Muhammad Yunus. Elections should have been held by now, but have been postponed till February 2026. There are doubts if it would be held even then. Bangladesh's protests demonstrate a different dynamic than Sri Lanka's. Whereas Sri Lanka's Aragalaya was a unifying civic eruption, Bangladesh's protests were shaped by a political, polarized battlefield. The result was more violent. Yet, like Sri Lanka, Bangladesh now faces the harder task, moving from the romance of the street to the reality of reform. Let's turn to Nepal. Nepal has experienced three major political ruptures in living memory. One, the 1990s People's Movement, or Jan Andolan, won. It restored multi-party democracy and clipped the monarch's powers. Two, 2006 People's Movement, or Jan Andolan 2, ended King Gyanedra's direct rule and paved the way for the monarchy's abolition. 3. 2008 Declaration of Republic. Nepal became a federal democratic republic with Maoists joining mainstream politics after a decade-long insurgency. These upheavals promised transformation. Yet 2 decades later, the promise has turned into disillusionment. Political instability has become endemic. There were 14 governments in 17 years, endless coalition reshuffles, and leaders recycling governments in a revolving door system. In Nepal, the trigger was the ban on social media platforms, but this was symptomatic of economic frustration, rising inflation, unemployment, corruption scandals, and elite stagnation. The Gen Z, as the student protesters called themselves, demanded better opportunities, accusing elites of squandering the Republican promise since the monarchy's fall in 2008. Then there were the Nepo kids, the children of corrupt politicians flaunting Ferraris and Guccis on TikTok, wearing expensive watches and foreign trips. Elite privilege passed to the children of the powerful. The protests are still at a nascent stage and less violent so far compared to Bangladesh. 19 people, mostly students, were killed on 8 September, radicalizing the protesters. They achieved their objective of forcing Prime Minister KP Oli to step down. An interim Prime Minister has been appointed, the Parliament has been dissolved, and fresh elections will be held. There is a question mark about the Constitution. The interim government has a big challenge in restoring law and order and rebuilding the infrastructure destroyed and restoring confidence in Nepal. Nepal's protest completes the South Asia trio of unrest. Each country illustrates a different stage of the protest cycle. Sri Lanka, success but limited reform. Bangladesh, violent overthrow. Nepal, overthrow and interim government. Together, they signal a regional pattern, the exhaustion of legitimacy among South Asia's ruling elites and the impatience of the youth. From Colombo to Dhaka to Kathmandu, South Asia's streets remind us that governments cannot indefinitely mortgage legitimacy. Economic collapse, corruption, and dynastic arrogance create tinder. Youth strike the match. Though distinct, the three protest movements share patterns and divergences and have common lessons. 1. Economic fragility is political fragility. 2. Youth as a vanguard. 3. The important role of social media. 4. Leaderless movements have the ability to delegitimize and degrade governments. 5. The state's response shapes outcomes. Two other points are important. One, there have been claims of outside interference. However, other than suspicions and circumstantial evidence, there is nothing in the public domain yet about an external power engineering the protests in any of the three countries. Almost all media reports have detailed internal causes of the protests. Second, the role demography has played in the protests. In Sri Lanka, the median age is around 35 years as per 2025 estimates, and the population under 30 is about 43%. In Bangladesh, the median age is around 27 years, 2025 estimates, and the population under 30 is close to 60%. In Nepal, the median age is around 24 years, 2025 estimates, and the population under 30 is roughly 65%. What these figures tell us is that Nepal is the youngest, which explains why protests there resemble a student uprising, with high schoolers in uniforms on the front lines. Bangladesh is slightly older, but still youthful. Student movements have always shaped its politics, from the independence struggle in 1971 to the 2024 uprising. Sri Lanka is aging faster. Protests there were broader, cutting across age groups, not purely youth-led. One can therefore summarize that Nepal and Bangladesh are sitting on a youth bulge that can be either a demographic dividend or a political time bomb, if not channeled productively. Sri Lanka's unrest was triggered mainly by economic collapse, while Nepal and Bangladesh reflect generational anger at corrupt elites. Taken together, these protests suggest a wider South Asian churn. Citizens are impatient with elites who monopolize power but fail at governance. Dynasties, the Rajpaksas in Sri Lanka, anti-incumbency and perception of authoritarianism with the Hasina family in Bangladesh, traditional politicians of the Nepali Congress, Maoists and UML Old Guard face exhaustion of legitimacy. Youth are demanding accountability across ethnic and class lines. What about India? How should India be looking at these developments and in its immediate neighborhood? Let us look at the following factors. 1. Geography and proximity. India shares long land borders with Nepal, 1,750 kilometers, and Bangladesh, 4,100 kilometers. Sri Lanka lies just across the Palk Strait, barely 30 kilometers from Tamil Nadu. Any instability in these countries spills quickly into India through migration, smuggling, or cross-border movements. Second, security implications. Nepal. The open border allows free movement. Prison escapees or militant infiltration can directly affect Indian states like Bihar, UP, and Uttarakhand. Bangladesh. Past unrest has pushed refugees into India. Communal violence there can inflame tensions in West Bengal and Assam. Sri Lanka. The Tamil question still resonates in Tamil Nadu. Political turmoil there could rekindle old separatist sentiments. 3. Economic interdependence. India is the largest trading partner for all three countries. Nepal, 70% of imports come through India. Remittances from Nepalis working in India are vital. Bangladesh, bilateral trade is in billions of dollars. Instability threatens Indian investment in power and connectivity projects. Sri Lanka, India provided billions in aid during the 2022 crisis. Indian businesses are deeply invested in ports, energy, and tourism. Fourth, the China factor. Beijing uses instability in South Asia to expand its influence. In Nepal, China pushes Belt and Road projects. In Bangladesh, it funds infrastructure and ports. In Sri Lanka, it already controls Hambantota port on a 99-year lease. If India steps back, China will fill the vacuum. And sixth, domestic politics in India. Protests and violence in these countries often spill into Indian states with cultural and ethnic ties. Tamil Nadu reacts strongly to events in Sri Lanka. West Bengal and Assam are deeply sensitive to what happens in Bangladesh. Bihar and UP share kinship ties with people across the Nepali border. The bottom line is that for India, these are not distant neighbors, but extensions of its own strategic, economic, and social landscape. Instability threatens India's security. It affects trade and energy supplies. It fuels migration and social tensions inside India. And it opens the door wider for China. That's why India cannot afford to ignore what happens in Nepal, Bangladesh, and Sri Lanka. Incidentally, those of you who watched episode 16 of my podcast titled Population, the Ticking Time Bomb on Pakistan's Demography, should think about whether Pakistan could be a likely candidate for the next round of protests in the neighborhood. Thank you for watching. Do like, share, and comment. See you again soon with another topic. Until then, I am Tilak Devasher. Namaskar and Jai Hind.